So we are talking poetry in this engagement. Poetry of what I call the new guard, the new guard to appear in Sri Lankan English writing over the last 10 years. So roughly, I'm looking at the poetry scene between 2010 and now. It's a bit tricky to actually get into a discussion of poetry targeting this kind of little time capsule because 2010 to 2020, the moment we are passing through right now, is also the time that has seen unprecedented changes in the poetry scene in terms of platform, in terms of technology. It's a transformative age where we can't anymore look at poetry, the production, circulation, and reception of poetry within the traditional parameters as it being an exclusively printed medium in the conventional sense. So basically, the way we would have discussed Sri Lankan poetry or any kind of writing up to about 2010, I would say is a bit obsolete and no longer valid because with the emergence and the spread of new media platforms, Facebook, Instagram included, and with the growth of domains like slam poetry or spoken word platforms, I think the understanding as well as the reach of poetry, the people who actually engage in poetry production, everything has changed. But I'm going to limit this discussion to conventional domains, our conventional understanding of poetry production, circulation, and reception. So I'm going by the printed medium with which all of us are familiar. So when it comes to Sri Lankan poetry by and large, and when we kind of zoom in on what we call what I call the new guard, the people who are in the business right now, there are several household names. But in order to generate a discussion, I'm also sensitive to people who have been consistent in production, people who have been in it. So people who might qualify as a one-time wonder, or people who have been in but then again out the next day from the poetry discourse, will be for this encounter left out of the scene, unless of course this person happens to be someone with great promise who can benefit us by being included in this discussion. People like, for example, Madri Kalugala, who only has one published collection of poetry in 2016, but in whom I see a promise to be one of the leading poets Sri Lanka produces if she kind of keeps on to her craft, keeps on to an experiment. Madhuri also has, I think, a very powerful poetry blog. The blog is titled "A Tree Grows in Me." A poetry collection, I should have mentioned this, is called "An Almond Moon and the White Owl," published in 2016. So unless it's someone promising and with obvious talent, an obvious commitment to both the stylistic, the technical aspects of um, understanding, committing to poetry, as well as the aesthetic execution in it, I will be kind of anchoring this discussion on people who have published regularly, at least in excess of two collections in the last 10 to 12 years. So Sri Lankan poetry, um, an entry into that discussion would be through the gateway of two poets we take quite seriously, poets who have been writing before our time, The gateway would be through two dominant ideas which have stayed back with me as a reader of poetry. So these two writers, one is Richard de Souza, writing in the 1980s predominantly, and Lakdas Wickramasinghe, uh, who had a career of 13 years between 1965 and 1978 before his untimely demise. In his poem Talking About Michelangelo, Richard de Souza talks about this business of poetry writing. So, who is a poet and what does it mean to compose poetry? That is Richard de Souza's question in talking about Michelangelo, which in many ways is a critique of the middle class English speaking metropolitan poetry circle of which he himself was a part. So he asks the question: does poetry or literature mean, wearing a serious face, um, appearing sad, and hanging around in cocktail parties? Is that what it means to be a poet and to be producing poetry? Or as Lakdas Wickramasinghe asks in his fairly popularly wide-known poem called "The Poet," does writing poetry entail, metaphorically speaking, dropping a bomb and taking notes about it? So if these two observations, hanging out, fashionably in a cocktail circuit, looking sad and serious, saying things that appear to be like pearls of wisdom, and then again dropping bombs and taking notes, creating a stir and recording reactions. If I take these two as a kind of a gateway to enter this discussion, I think we can anchor a few ideas around which I want to train this limited interaction today. So I would again, building on these two notions, these two ideas, ask the question: what does it mean to be a poet? Does it mean, I take this further, I ask, does it mean that being a poet is an ongoing experimentation with craftsmanship, how you approach society, but with an aesthetic, a poetic idiom that you continuously invest on, trying to develop it, trying to shape it as you go along? Is that what it means to be a poet in our modern context? Or is it to subject oneself to verbal diarrhea, words, a huge heap of words as it comes to you, relentlessly letting it go day after day? So here I'm trying to focus on people who compose as poets and who produce in huge volumes. Sometimes I myself could be in this category. There are spells like that, but words for the sake of words. Or is poetry, as some people make us question this idea of being a poet, is it actually an act of is it an act of acting out? Is it a kind of an externalization of anxiety? The anxiety you feel in yourself, you let it go through being a poet or writing what you consider as poetry. So in that way, it's a kind of masturbation. Is it poetry or being a poet? So these are the questions I want to raise when I enter this idea of the new guard in the last 10 years who have taken over Sri Lankan poetry from some of the old guard or the ancients, the generation that ends with writers like Regis Siriwardhan, Ashley Halpe, but writers who have been more circulated internationally and locally, which includes perhaps Jean Arasanayagam and Anne Ranasinghe. So the line that ends there with Anne Ranasinghe and Jean Arasanayagam, who I think, in my understanding, probably the most widely read of poets of Sri Lankan heritage. Um, so taking on from them 2010 to to our times, the present moment, the first observation to make is that we don't have many poets who have been consistent in production over time. So we come across, so these are like names I have filtered into this discussion from a slightly longer list. Um, but we do come across writers like Ramya Jeerasinghe, Chamali Karyavasam. Chamali Karyavasam actually has some poems which I kind of like, but they haven't been producing much consistently. So maybe a couple of volumes over a 10, 12, 15-year period. Ramya Jeerasinghe and Chamali both been writing since the 2000s, the first decade there. And then we have people, more recent debuts like Dilantha Gunawardana. Dilantha, as far as I know, has published two collections with some fairly powerful poems. And unless I'm mistaken, he's working on a third collection. So we have players like Ramya, Chamali, Dilantha. But then I think the big two names that stand out, 2010, 2020, that decade, are the names of Malinda Seneviratne and Vivimarie Vanderpoorten. So these are the two big fish in that list. Um, of course, I think another contender could very well be myself, but I don't think I have got the kind of recognition from critics or academics that merit a place in that list. Of course, Malinda Seneviratne has some um, memorable things to say about me. Malinda has actually come to the conclusion my poetry is much better than my prose. But in a way, both Malinda and myself haven't been kind of taken in by the academy as poets worthy of a place in bigger and better places. So let me kind of excuse myself for the time being. Uh, Malinda Seneviratne is kind of an interesting writer for me personally for two reasons. One is the kind of repertoire he brings in, where he's drawing from, equally drawing from both the Sinhalese and the English exposure he has in associating literature. And I think this is a very crucial observation among our English writing circles, because very rarely do we find people who are proficient or equipped enough in drawing from the bilingual department. I'm not very sure whether Malinda considers himself equal on both areas, but definitely he is someone who has managed to set in conference his literary exposure and inspiration of both the Sinhala and the English. I think the testimonies where Malinda is a winner of the Gratian Prize 2013-ish, if I remember, and also the parallel prize offered by the Gratian Trust for translation, 2012, I think. He has done several translations, including difficult translations, or rather manuscripts or works considered to be difficult, like Simon Navagattegam, for example. So he is someone, definitely. If I go back to that initial question, um, arrived at through the gateway of the cocktail party and dropping bombs. The question of what does it mean to be a poet? Is it commitment to continuous experimentation? Malinda definitely fits that bill. And also, Malinda is someone who produces at a feverish rate. I'm not very sure about now, but there was a time where he produced consistently, malarially, but half decent poetry most of the time. And I think between 2007 and 2014, he published five collections, and these five collections come on top of so many other poems he published on his blog, published in news media, and also on top of a very enigmatic debut collection of poetry which dates back to 1998, a collection called Epistles, a collection that I personally rank very high because Epistles collects a series of very deeply politically informed poetry from a different phase of Malinda's life growing up. So most of the poetry in epistles draw inspiration from his time growing up in Peradeniya, a young Malinda Seneviratne, coming of age in so many ways. Then, of course, the poetry in the later work. There are some political commitments, political concerns, especially during the closing stages of the war and the immediate post-war period where the Sri Lankan state was facing a lot of pressure from international circles relating to its the way it kind of handled um, situations which have given rise to continuing human rights debates. Malind actually addressed some of those accusations in his writing. So personally, I might have differences in opinion about what was said and that kind of response. But the point that I want to bring into this discussion is that there was a response. So there was a kind of politics at play. But saying that, the bulk of his published work of recent datage, they have detracted from that kind of political commitment, which is not a problem. It is just an observation. So Malinda Seneviratne, and of course the other name is the name of Vivimarie Vanderpoorten. So Vivimarie kind of hits the scene, takes it by storm. 2007 collection called Nothing Prepares You. And so far, the trend or what is available to us is that Vivimarie publishes once every 5 years or so, so with a decent break. So after um, Nothing Prepares You, which started with a kind of a high point with a Grecian plum, which was very refreshing for Sri Lankan writing, quite positively received by both critics and academics, even pushing Vivimarie overnight into kind of literary stardom. Very rarely you see a Sri Lankan poet featured on the cover pages of mass circulation, laminated, glossy magazines. She kind of received a little bit more criticism with her for her second collection, quite enigmatically titled Stitch Your Eyelids Shut." This was 2010, 2011. Well, I'm also, I think, responsible for saying um, some things about Vivimarie's writing, things I would say differently now if I had to actually write about these things. If at all this can be an excuse, my excuse would be at the time I was 24, yeah, 23 or 24. But there were other reviewers who were writing to papers, especially leading very fruitful and widely circulated features sections at the time, who attacked Vivimarie largely for her craft, the way she crafts her poetry, more than the sentiments. The sentiments were okay, but some reviewers I remember reading this. They were not very happy with the poetics or the absence of it in the actual the crafting of the writing. But 5 years later, when she published Borrowed Dust, I think Vivi Murray had made a kind of a comeback. So if I have to kind of rank her three collections, definitely Nothing Prepares You comes at the top. Then Borrowed Dust, Stitch Your Eyelids Shut at third. I wonder whether Stitch Your Eyelids Shut kind of deviated for some reason, took Vivi Murray away from the natural path, her natural game as a poet, and whether with that digression, in the interim, she kind of staged a comeback into the kind of terrain where she is more comfortable to be herself and write more true to heart. So these are the two big poets who make the last 10 years the pioneering figures of what I consider Sri Lanka's new guard to emerge and to sustain the discourse of poetry in the print medium. So between them, they share those two sterling tenets laid out by Richard de Souza, being at the cocktail party, wearing a serious face, but not at the expense of what Lapdas Vikramasinghe suggests, dropping bombs and taking notes.